Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's webinar from HR Solutions. The topic of interest today is about how to facilitate a safe return to work during the COVID-19 pandemic. We've got quite a few people on this webinar with us today, so I'm just going to do a few introductions. So we have myself, Greg Guilford, I'm the CEO of HR Solutions. And we have Victoria Templeton, who's our HR Knowledge Manager, and this is the first time she's run a webinar with us today, so please go easy on her. We have Dean Howells, who's the Managing Director of Essential Safety. We also have Sue Watson, our HR Operations Manager, and Ateem Arden, our Digital Marketing Executive. In terms of what we're aiming to cover today, this is our agenda. So we're going to be reviewing the current situation, talk about resource planning, how to unfurlough, practical considerations of returning to work, and then Dean will also be talking about health and safety and risk assessments. For those of you who've been on a webinar before, you'll know that we mute everybody when you join the webinar. So unfortunately, you won't be able to talk to us, but we do obviously want to have questions from you, and we'll be taking those at the end of each section. You should be able to see a GoToWebinar pop out on your laptop or computer, and there will be a little section there that says questions. If you want to pose any of your questions in there, then we'll collate those together and ask those at the end of each section. We also aim to make these sessions as interactive as possible, as we would with any normal physical event. We try to engage our audience. So we're trying to do that by raising some polls with you. Those of you familiar with how it works, that will be straightforward for you, but if you haven't been on our webinar before, there will be a pop-up in the middle of your screen that will have the question and the options that relate to that question, and you just simply click the one that is most relevant, or if there's multiple choices, tick all that apply. So that's the housekeeping out of the way. So we are going to start the webinar with a quick couple of polls just to sort of understand our audience and to get a feel for the types of questions that we're likely to experience. So the first poll is, have you furloughed any of your employees? And quite simply, it's a yes or no answer. So I can see quite a few of you are voting already. We're just waiting for a few more and then we'll close the poll and share the results. Okay, most of you have completed the poll now, so I'm just going to close it and then share it. So you should be able to see that 71% of you have already furloughed staff, which is pretty much in line with what the government is saying. 70% of UK workforce have furloughed staff. So just to follow on that vein, in the next 3 months, are you planning to unfurlough any staff? Quite a few voting already. Okay, I'm just going to close that now. So it's a slightly different split. So 49% of you are saying that in the next 3 months you're expecting to unfurlough some staff, and then there's 33% that don't know yet. So it's quite a mixed result. And then the last poll I'm going to run before I hand you over to Victoria is coming up on your screen now. And it's quite simply, do you feel you are clear on the current HMRC guidance? And it's quite simply yes or no. Okay, so there's quite a few responded already. I'm just going to do a few more seconds. Okay, I'm going to share the results now. So 61% of you felt that you are clear on it, and there's still about 40% saying that you're not clear on the current HMRC guidance. So it's a bit of a mixed result there. So that's the kind of introductory polls out the way. I'm now going to hand you over to Victoria. So if you just bear with us a second while we transfer over. Okay, I'm now going to pass you over to Victoria, who's going to run the rest of the webinar.
So good afternoon, and thank you, Greg. So the first part of the webinar is to set out the current situation, as a lot of information has come out since the weekend. So on Sunday, the 10th of May, the Prime Minister announced the move to a new phase in the response to COVID-19. We are now in phase 2, which is about staying alert, controlling the virus, and saving lives. A new COVID-19 alert system has been introduced, which will classify at which level the UK will operate in its response to COVID-19. It will be determined by the R rating, which is the infection rate, and a number of infections. So depending on which level the UK is sitting at, will determine which actions we can all implement. We have to be prepared, though, to move back and forth between levels, which could see the closing of workplaces again. It was also announced on Tuesday the 12th of May that the government's coronavirus job retention scheme will be extended until the end of October. So it was originally planned to end on the 30th of June. So this is seen as welcome news, as it gives business that little bit longer before having to make some long-term permanent decisions, such as redundancies. I will talk more about this latest update further on in the webinar today. So what we know from the current situation and the advice is that we should work from home wherever possible. However, anyone who cannot work from home should be actively encouraged to attend work. A return to work, though, must be safe, and to help employers, the government have introduced guidance to make workplaces COVID-19 secure. There are guidance notes relevant to different sectors, and you can access these by visiting the link that I've shown on the screen here. What is worth highlighting is that these guides have been created in consultation with the Health and Safety Executive, trade unions and professional bodies. It has also been reported that £14 million has been invested in the Health and Safety Executive to resource their contact centres, but also help them to resource the ability to carry out extra spot checks and inspections of workplaces. The latest government advice is to keep distance from people outside your household by maintaining at least 2 metres. Keep hands and face as clean as possible, washing hands regularly. Reduce the number of people you spend time with within a work setting. Avoid crowds and do not gather in groups of more than 2. If you have to travel, think about how and when you travel. Wash your clothes regularly. Keep indoor places well ventilated. And if possible, wear face coverings, where in an enclosed space where social distances is not possible, or when you come into contact with people you do not normally meet, for example, when using public transport. When at work, follow the advice given by your employer. And now people entering the UK, with the exception of those travelling from France, must self-isolate for 14 days. So we shall now briefly acknowledge the importance of resource planning and the options available in light of COVID-19. So given the impact of COVID-19, reviewing business plans and operating models will be vital to ensuring your business's continued operation. Consider what roles you need in your operation moving forward. And so if any are furloughed, which ones do you need to bring back? When do you need the roles back at work again? And will a furlough scheme enable you to operate for longer in the hope that the extra financial support and extended time can help you to keep operating, which ultimately means either delaying redundancies or even avoiding them? Can you support all your employees coming back in terms of whether there's enough work, and can you afford to pay all employees? This review process may result in some difficult steps needing to be taken, which we'll now come on to look at. So there are a number of options, so you can utilise furlough. The aim of furlough was to prevent redundancies, and whilst employees do not have to use it, serious consideration should be given to it before making somebody redundant. The Chancellor has now confirmed that the scheme is to be extended until the end of October, and it has been confirmed that between now and the end of July there will be no change to the scheme. But from August through to the end of October, employees on furlough will be able to carry out part-time work for their employer. This is a change to the current rules, as currently furloughed employees are not allowed to work for their employer who has furloughed them. It is expected that from August, employers will need to contribute towards the costs of the scheme, but we do not have the detail as yet, and we're expecting to see that by the end of May. Layoff is another option. So long as you have a contractual right to do so, this temporary measure to lay employees off would see those employees with over 1 month's service become eligible for a statutory government payment of £29 per day for 5 days in any 3-month period. This could be used if you anticipate work picking up in the near future and can see the return of your employees back to the workplace. Short-time working is another temporary option, which again will require you to have the contractual right to impose. Short-time working is where employees work reduced hours and have their pay reduced accordingly. Both these two options could still be achieved if you did not have the contractual clause allowing it. However, if this is the case, it's really important that you consult and seek written consent and agreement to it. Otherwise, you could face breach of contract and constructive dismissal claims. And so redundancy. If you are contemplating making redundancies, then it's crucial that you follow legislation in terms of consultation and a fair process. You need to be aware of the deadlines for starting consultation. Do also check your contracts of employment to check what the notice periods are in case you enhance notice. This will help you in planning the timing of when you commence the process, and you can run notice periods simultaneously to periods of furlough. As a reminder, if you plan to make more than 100 roles redundant, you are required to consult for 45 days. If you plan to make more than 20 roles redundant but less than 100, you are required to consult for 30 days. And if you plan to make less than 20 roles redundant, then consultation has to be sufficiently long enough to ensure that you can demonstrate that you've meaningfully consulted. We would recommend in general a 2-week consultation process, but obviously some situations may warrant more. Be careful to not inadvertently discriminate by making those on furlough redundant. As you'll know, furlough can be used for those with caring responsibilities. So those on furlough for this reason are likely to be female employees. And equally, employees who are shielding can also be furloughed, in which case they will have a very serious medical condition which is likely to qualify as a disability under the Equality Act. Taking a stance to choose those on furlough to be made redundant therefore could render the dismissal discriminatory and unfair. The final option is around unfurloughing staff and bringing them back to work, whether this is working from home or back to the workplace. Make sure you can justify those employees who you are unfurloughing over other employees by keeping records of your approach taken, and we will explore approaches to unfurloughing shortly. So I'm going to hand over to Greg and we'll do another short poll.
Hi, thank you, Victoria. So I'm just going to launch the next poll, which is really about what do you think will be the next steps you take with your employees? So the options are begin or extend furlough, layoffs, short-time working, redundancy, or unfurloughing. So it's quite a mixed result coming through at the moment. I'm just going to give it a few more seconds for a few more people to vote. Okay, the votes are slowing down, so I'm going to close that and share the results with you now. So you can see there's a real mixture coming through. Layoffs obviously seems to be the least popular option, or the least option that people are going to take forward. but then begin or extend furlough is still quite prevalent. But then there is 48% that are looking to perhaps start to unfurlough people as well, which is interesting statistics. So now I'm going to hide that poll and Victoria will carry on.
Thank you, Greg. Okay, so we're going to now look to ways in which we can unfurlough, and we'll have a look at a number of options that you've bear with me 2 seconds. Okay, so before we go into some practical examples, there are a number of legal considerations. So before COVID-19, furlough didn't exist. So there's no framework set out in law on how to manage either furloughing or unfurloughing. However, we do have obligations in respect of the Employment Rights Act, in particular Section 44 and Section 100. And we also have the Equality Act. So compliance with these must guide our strategy for how to approach unfurloughing. So as a reminder, the Equality Act protects people from being discriminated, and the Employment Rights Act protects people from being unfairly or constructively dismissed. Determining an unfurlough strategy up front will help you to ensure you unfurlough your employees fairly and objectively and in line with your legal obligations. We would advise having a documented thought process to evidence the approach should it ever be challenged. And finally, the Health and Safety Act, which is fundamental in bringing your employees back to the workplace. If the workplace isn't safe, employees are unable to return. So let's now look at practical examples for unfurloughing staff. So consider how long people have been furloughed for and who you can claim for. So depending on timings, it might be that you have adopted a staggered furlough approach and so have some employees who have been on furlough for less than the required 3-week minimum duration. So to bring back an employee who has been on furlough less than 3 weeks will actually mean that you will not be able to claim for the grant under the scheme. So it may be best and reasonable, therefore, to keep those on furlough and bring those back who have been on leave longer than the 3 weeks. Another way is a process that's based on skills and experience. And that's a more involved process that's focused on the skills and experience of those on furlough, grading employees on these attributes, and the ones with the highest scores are brought back. You can also look to seek for volunteers. If you do not need everybody to return at once, you can ask for volunteers, and this may seem the fairest but could present some challenges. So if people feel anxious about returning to work, they may not come forward to volunteer. And equally, you may have everybody come forward and you then have to apply a selection process. Look at the business activity. So you could consider basing it on the business needs and looking at your work activity you have in the pipeline and your business plans. And look at the personal circumstances. So you could consider personal circumstances, bearing in mind not to use discriminatory criteria. But for example, if you have an employee who is shielding, so they have a serious underlying medical condition, you could decide to continue to furlough that employee to protect them and their health and safety at work. You could identify roles that can operate from home and bring those back first. So for those whose roles allow for working from home, you could prioritise this group, and then this could be considered as one way to maintain social distancing that the government is advising. It is important to note that even if your furlough agreement allows for an immediate recall to work, you should still give employees reasonable notice for coming back. This is particularly important given that many people will have childcare or other responsibilities which they may need to make arrangements for. What is also important is that you ensure you confirm the end of furlough in writing. And a few weeks ago, the government announced that furlough records must be kept for 5 years, and it is expected that HMRC will audit employers around their use of the scheme during this period. We're now going to talk about the employee communication, and it's going to be key in supporting an employee's return. Your employees will want to be reassured that their workplace is safe. Open and transparent communication will be essential. How you engage and communicate with your employees is key to how employees transition back, how supported they feel, and will also help you to seek their buy-in to any new measures you introduce as a result of COVID-19. Communicate your strategy and plans for a safe return to work. Your messaging is going to be key for how employees perceive levels of threat, and being open and transparent in how you're safeguarding them will help their understanding, and you are more likely to gain their support. So, for example, they will want to know that you are following government advice. They will want to know that you are carrying out risk assessments. They'll want to know that you have their safety as priority, and they'll want to know that you have the required PPE to enable safe working practices. One example of how you can remind your workforce that you've done all you can to provide a safe workplace is to display a poster like this. This is what the government have published this week for workplaces to use. The emotional impact of COVID-19 is also an important consideration too. The psychological impact is significant. We are in unprecedented and uncertain times. Supporting the mental well-being of your staff will be of utmost importance. Communication that is clear, open and transparent will help towards providing clarity to your employees, even if it is only clarity about what is happening now. Many employees are likely to feel anxious in returning, so it will be key to reassure them that the workplace is safe. Also remember that there may be those employees who will know family or friends who have either suffered from COVID-19 or sadly passed away. Where you offer an employee assistance programme, be sure to remind your employees of this in advance of returning, but also throughout their return. Where you do not have an employee assistance scheme in place, then do still direct them to available support such as Mind, Anxiety UK, or even to their own GP. And ultimately, your aim is to have everybody returning to work and feeling safe. Training is really important too. So think about your new starters. Those who are new to the business just before lockdown will most likely benefit from part or even all of their induction being repeated. Are you introducing their new working practices in light of social distancing? In which case, ensure your workforce are trained on them so that everybody is working safely. Your line managers will need to be alert on what to do should a team member display COVID-19 symptoms. So put in place guidance for your line managers so they are prepared should this happen. We're now going to move on to practical considerations for return to work, and I believe we may have a further poll.
Yeah, we're just going to got a couple of polls before we carry on with the practical considerations. So I'm just going to launch the first poll, and that is, do you have any employees who are currently COVID-19 symptomatic? And it's just a yes or no answer. Okay, so there's quite a few voted already. I'm just going to give it a few more seconds while the votes slow down. Okay, and I'm going to close that and share the results. So you can see there that 14% of you have employees who are currently COVID-19 symptomatic, but most of you, 86%, don't, which is quite an interesting statistic, if I can say it. And then I'm just going to move on to the next poll, which is, do you have any employees who are reluctant to return to work? And again, simple yes or no answers in this poll. Okay, we're just going to give it a few more seconds while the votes slow down. Okay, I'm going to close the poll. So you've got 72% saying yes, you do have employees who are reluctant to return to work, but 28% are saying no. So we're going to cover off some of those issues and how to resolve and deal with them in our next section as I pass you back to Victoria.
Thank you, Greg. So this section will look at the practical considerations for returning to work. The government's COVID-19 secure guidelines provide advice on social distancing measures and safe working practices across different sectors. We know that working from home is still the preferred option, however. Where working from home is not possible, then keeping at least 2 meters is going to be necessary. So from a HR perspective, we're going to look at some practical steps in how you can make adaptations to the role. Okay, so first of all, let's look at the role and how you can incorporate social distancing. So firstly, can the role operate from home? Well, we know the government is still advocating working from home if possible, and those employees who've been able to work from home over the last 6 or 7 weeks will have given you a good idea as to how they can still deliver the job. It would be reasonable to allow it to continue at this unprecedented time. But if operationally there is a challenge with the role operating 100% at home, then could the role operate perhaps between home and the office so that time on site is limited? And finally, can you change the way in which the work is carried out? So can you find new ways of working that relies more on technology and minimises face-to-face interactions? The second part is around how you can adapt working hours. So can you look at structuring the working day differently? So for those businesses, for example, who operate a typical 9-to-5 working day, can you spread the hours across the day to help you manage the number of people who are in? Can you change the start time or finish time so your employee avoids peak commute times? This is especially important for those using public transport. And can you accommodate temporary flexible working arrangements to support those with caring responsibilities? We know that schools, nurseries, childcare settings are returning gradually, and so some kind of flexible working may help to facilitate some form of return to work for working parents. The third and final area is looking at the working environment. Remember, workplaces will need to enforce social distancing and enable employees to maintain a 2-metre distance. But you could look at, for example, having a minimum number of people on site. We know that having large groups of people is a high risk factor for the spreading of the virus. The government advised to not have more than 2 people together when working in groups. You could look at putting posters throughout reminding employees about hand washing and social distancing. And you can rethink the physical setup of the working environment. You could face employees away from each other or side to side to avoid face-to-face contact, and you can avoid hot desking. You could also consider regulating the use of corridors, stairs and lifts. You could actually encourage the use of stairs over lifts, have a separate entrance and exit points for the building, have protective screening for reception areas, and you can use outdoor spaces for breaks. It's worth reviewing the first aid equipment and provide additional PPE, and think about whether you want to consider workplace temperature screening. Now with this, it's really important that you get the consent first before you do it, and you need to be mindful of the Equality Act, because acting inconsistently with workers runs a risk of facing direct discrimination and harassment claims. So consistency with all workers is key. You could consider having an employee declaration, so asking employees to complete a screening questionnaire in advance of returning to work, and by doing this it will guide you as to whether you're going to allow them to have access to the workplace or not. Asking questions on this questionnaire around have you had close contact with or cared for someone diagnosed in the last 14 days, or have you experienced any cold or flu-like symptoms in the last 14 days? Or is anybody in their household showing symptoms of COVID-19? And this questionnaire will help you, as I say, to establish whether you feel satisfied for them to come back into the workplace. Another important consideration is actually when people are back at work and managing and recording absences from work due to COVID-19. So record keeping is important. The government announced in March that SSP would be paid from day 1 of COVID-19 related absences, and they also announced that small businesses would be able to claim a refund on the SSP paid for the first 14 days. Now it's for an employer to determine what evidence they require in regard to COVID-19 related absences. However, we would recommend that some form of record keeping is kept, as you may be required to evidence SSP that you have made and claimed for through HMRC. Those employees who are absent directly related to COVID-19 are able to obtain an isolation note from NHS 111 online, and those who live with someone that has symptoms can get a note from the NHS website. In regards to absence management, you may also need to keep a record for general absence management purposes. So, for instance, when managing somebody's absence record under your usual absence management procedures, it is important to be flexible in your approach, and it would be reasonable to discount the absence record related directly to COVID-19. And finally, RIDDOR. A further consideration in regard to record keeping of COVID-19 is in respect of RIDDOR reporting and the reporting of injuries, diseases and dangerous occurrences regulations. All employers are required to make a RIDDOR report when an unintended incident at work has led to someone's possible or actual exposure to the coronavirus, a worker has been diagnosed as having COVID-19 and there is reasonable evidence that it was caused by exposure at work, or when a worker dies as a result of occupational exposure to coronavirus. So we're probably going to anticipate a number of people that actually feel nervous and anxious about returning to work. So we'll now consider what happens in the event of this situation. Well, the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations 1999 requires businesses to make a suitable and sufficient assessment of risks to employees' health and safety to which they're exposed to at work. Under the Employment Rights Act 1996, employees are protected when acting to protect their own or others' safety. An employee has the right not to be subjected to any detriment or be unfairly dismissed where the employee reasonably believed the danger to be so serious and imminent and chose to leave or refused work. It is very likely that COVID-19 would be considered as a serious and imminent risk by an employment tribunal. So under the Employment Rights Act 1996, employees must show that there were circumstances of danger which they reasonably believed to be serious and imminent. It will not matter what the employer thought. What matters is what the employee reasonably believed at the time they acted, i.e. refused to work or walked out of the workplace. Unlike general dismissal claims, an employee who brings a claim relating to health and safety does not need the usual 2-year service to bring a claim. Dismissals on health and safety grounds are automatically unfair. The relevant parts of the Employment Rights Act are sections 44 and 100. The Employment Rights Act section 43A through to 43L relates to employees who make protected disclosures, also known as whistleblowing, in that they are protected from dismissal, selection for redundancy, or from being made subject to a detriment. If you have an employee refusing to work, it's most likely because they do not feel safe or protected in returning due to a serious and imminent risk. And so to deal with this, you'll have to demonstrate to the employee that the workplace is safe for their return, and you would do this through your risk assessment process. So listen and be sympathetic. If an employee refuses to work as they do not feel safe or protected in returning, remember COVID-19 is likely to be seen as a serious and imminent risk by the courts for the purpose of the Employment Rights Act. Listen and be sympathetic to what they have to say. You'll need to reassure your employee that the workplace is safe for them to return and talk through and explain your risk assessment. Explore further measures that could mitigate fears and anxiety. Hopefully by listening to the concern, you may be able to make a further adaptation to the workplace, role or hours that will hopefully resolve the matter. Do this through the risk assessment process. It may be that you return to the same outcome as the initial risk assessment, or you identify new measures to implement. This will be your evidence should you ever be challenged around how you support a safe return to work. So what happens if after all this they still refuse? You believe the workplace is safe, yet they do not. What next? Do you use unpaid leave, or do you consider a disciplinary process? Well, if you're unable to reassure the employee and you firmly believe through having completed a thorough risk assessment that the workplace is safe, then consider if you can to allow the employee a reasonable period of unpaid leave or allow them to take annual leave. This would be seen by a tribunal as seeking the middle ground. Using the disciplinary process as a way to manage the refusal to attend work would be a risky approach. given COVID-19 would likely be deemed by a tribunal to be such a serious and imminent risk to people's health. Remember, under the Employment Rights Act 1996, employees must show that there were circumstances of danger which they reasonably believe to be serious and imminent. It will not matter what the employer thought, but what matters is what the employee reasonably believed at the time that they acted. Disciplinary action is likely to be seen as inappropriate and unreasonable during this period. The use of agreed unpaid leave or using holiday would be, as I say, the middle ground. If you believe the workplace is safe, yet an employee is still refusing to attend. What also needs to be considered is that if an employee feels they're being forced to work in an unsafe workplace, they have protection for raising their concerns, as they would be raising protected disclosures under the Employment Rights Act and could lead to whistleblowing claims. So we're now at the point of having a few questions.
Okay, hello everybody. We've had quite a few questions. I'm going to try and group them into kind of topics so that we can hopefully cover off several in one go. So first of all, Victoria, when somebody completes the screening declaration and they are unable to return, how do we treat that absence?
So if they've got symptoms, then for me it's a sickness absence, and therefore they're entitled to the SSP, which we know is from day one, as per the government's changes a few weeks back, and for which you can claim the refund for the first 14 days. If they don't have symptoms, then can they work from home? If they can't work from home, is there any other work that they could do that could be completed? And if not, then explore, is there a period of unpaid leave or annual leave that you could take for that short period of time? Because essentially, you know, then they're not satisfying the employer that they're, you know, I guess there's a risk to the work site for them coming on site, and it's about mitigating that risk.
Okay, thank you. So if you've carried out a risk assessment, what happens if one of your team members doesn't want to come back?
So it's, as I said a moment ago, the risk assessment is your key document, and it's trying to really understand what the concerns are and trying to think creatively about how you can resolve those concerns. Ultimately, you've done your risk assessment, you're deeming it a safe place to work, but if they're not wanting to, then can you get that middle ground? If you can't find any other measures to implement, then can they take a period of unpaid leave? Because ultimately you're saying the workplace is safe and you're trying to find that compromise.
Okay, thank you. So somebody said their employee's daughter is shielding, and she doesn't want to come back to work. What should they do?
So again, it's around understanding the role that employee does and can they work from home. So understandably, that employee is going to be nervous if they're living with a family member that's highly, extremely vulnerable. So can they work from home in any way? And I guess it's can you look at the workplace so that they could attend work, but through having taken extra vigilant steps for social distancing. So can you be creative with working hours so they're not as exposed to as great a number of people than you know, ordinarily? Can they avoid public transport? So are they having to rely on it to get to work? Well, can they find a way of getting to work without doing that? So it's about mitigating and reducing that risk, and we know the government talks about regular hand washing, avoiding public transport, that 2-metre distancing, so it's been extra vigilant with those measures.
Thank you. We have got quite a lot of other questions, so whichever we don't get to answering now will either be covered off by Dean in the next part of the presentation, or we will respond back with a Q&A sheet in the next day or so. So if we haven't answered your question, bear with us and we will try and get something to you. Just to cover off, there were a couple of questions around the new rules on the furlough scheme from August to October. We have no idea how that's going to work yet. The government have been very limited in what they've told us, and they've said they're going to give us full details by the end of this month. So as soon as we know anything, we will be updating everything and updating our guidance, and we'll let you know. I think at that stage, we better hand back to Greg, I think.
No, Dean's going to take over the next section for us.
Okay.
So I've made Dean the presenter.
Good afternoon, everybody. Delighted to be joining you this afternoon to talk about this ever-changing and dynamic situation. Before we start, just a few brief words about us at Essential Safety. We were established in 2006, work very closely with a wide range of clients in a broad range of sectors. We have a particularly strong philosophy about working closely and hand in hand with our clients rather than providing generic or off-the-shelf advice. So all of our work with our clients is very bespoke to them, and indeed we like to be part of the solution, not just stating the problems. So as outlined earlier by Victoria, just a brief recap on where we are today. Clearly the government's message remains to work from home wherever we can. Clearly that isn't applicable in a large number of roles, so inevitably employers are now considering, if they haven't already, bringing people back to the workplace. We're aware from our conversations with a number of our clients that they have been or are seriously considering opening up the workplace and are asking a lot of questions around the challenges that brings. Construction has stolen a bit of a march here, as you're probably aware from widespread media reports. Construction has been back at work for some time, and after some initial concerns regarding particularly welfare areas, that sector now has tried and tested a number of methods that are working in the workplace, and we'll try to share some of those with you today. So another poll for you, particularly related to the safety issues that we're going to talk about this afternoon.
Okay, so I've just launched that for you, Dean. So the question is, how are you progressing with your COVID-19 risk assessment? You've got a number of options on the screen. If you just select one that applies to you, so not started yet, started but not completed, and completed. Quite a few already voted. Just waiting a few more, wait for the votes to slow down a little bit. Okay, I'm going to close the poll. So there you've got the results there for you. So 44% of you are saying you've not started your risk assessment yet. 43% have said you have started but not completed, and there's 13% saying that you have completed. I'm just going to hide that poll and then back to you, Dean.
Thank you, Greg. Very interesting that of the attendees today, 13% have actually completed their risk assessment. So the encouraging thing about it is there's plenty of opportunity for us to support and maybe provide some advice around that during this afternoon. So based on the conversations we've had with our clients to date, we're hearing a few frequently occurring challenges that our clients are having. Clearly, we're working to an extent in unknown territory here. Clearly, we don't have any case law yet to refer back to. There is no specific health and safety legislation for us to refer to. So we deciding what is reasonable or in safety language reasonably practicable under the circumstances is proving to be quite challenging for a number of clients. One of the ways we're advising clients in that respect is to benchmark that standard against existing health and safety legislation, and we'll come on to that a little bit more later. And as Victoria talked about on a number of occasions earlier, clearly many employees are concerned about returning to work. The severity of the risk is very hard to calculate because it's so varied between different groups. So quite understandably, employees may range from being very frightened and very scared about the risk to, on some occasions, quite blasé and quite complacent about it. So again, in our experience, clients are facing significant challenges reassuring their employees in that respect. And I think it's very useful to reflect on and remind ourselves of the 5 key points that the government have outlined in their guidance. Again, to reiterate, they have advised that we should work from home wherever we can. Recently started introducing the concept of a COVID-19 risk assessment, something we've been talking to clients about for a few weeks now, but is now part of the wider language. And then some very simple principles, basically keeping people 2 meters apart where we can, but if we can't, then having quite robust procedures and precautions in place. And reflecting and looking at very closely the contact points around the workplace and making sure that our cleaning regimes are suitably robust to handle those. And I would suggest that for those of us that find ourselves in a position where we're being measured or asked to justify our decisions and our risk assessments around COVID-19, I would suggest that these 5 key points would be a good place to start. If we can demonstrate that we have followed these key points, I would suggest that's what we're going to be necessarily measured against or even audited against by statutory bodies. The good news is that we have now gone from a situation with very limited guidance, and that guidance mostly being quite sector specific. As I mentioned earlier, construction were one of the first sectors to really get their heads around getting back to work and getting back onto site. We've now moved to a situation where we have quite a lot of guidance, both published by the government itself and then other professional bodies that are interpreting that and publishing it in a wider context and specific to their sector. I've also found the gov.uk email bulletins really helpful, and if you haven't yet subscribed to those, it might be worth looking into that. I'm probably receiving about 6 or 8 emails a day with revised and new guidance. Clearly, you may choose to be more selective about the areas that you decide to subscribe to, but it is a very good way of keeping in touch with what is indeed a very evolving circumstance. I mentioned earlier the guides that the government have produced. They're very user-friendly, very helpful, broken down into 8 work areas, 8 work activities or locations. They're all downloadable as searchable PDFs, and those of you who are familiar with researching approved codes or guidance documents will be aware of how useful it is to be able to search through a document to find a particular chapter or question that you're looking at. And they do provide, although they are sector specific, there is quite a lot of overlap between them. As you would expect, there is a level of duplication, a level of commonality between different sectors, but I have found them very useful, and I know clients have done as well in terms of deciding what precautions to take in their workplace. The guides do contain quite a wide range of practical examples of how to maintain social distancing within your workplace. You can see a few various examples here, ranging from reception areas to warehouse briefing areas, passenger lifts, even inside vehicles, transport vehicles, minibuses, etc. So there are a great deal examples within the guides that we can fall back on. And I would strongly encourage anybody who's managing or assessing the risks relating to this hazard within your workplace to get hold of those guides and to use them as a good starting point, at least for your measures. So let's have another poll. I think, Greg, you're going to facilitate this.
Yep, so another poll. So the very quick question, how are you keeping up to date with the evolving COVID-19 restrictions and guidance? So have you subscribed to the gov.uk notifications? Are you following press and media announcements, or are you using a consultancy? So quite a few already responded. We'll just give it a few more moments. Okay, I'm just going to close the poll. So you can see there's a mixture of results coming through there. So 38% have subscribed to the government notifications, 51% relying on press and media announcements, and then 11% are using a consultancy. And I'm just going to hide that and pass it back to you, Dean.
Thank you, Greg. Interesting that 38% are subscribing to the Gov UK notifications. As I mentioned earlier, I would strongly encourage people to consider at least those notifications. They are a very good method of keeping in touch. So we mentioned earlier, and Victoria mentioned at some length as well, that employees will be nervous about returning to work, but maybe looking at this from a slightly different angle, maybe we should think about how nervous employers are as well. And the vast majority of employers and custodians that I've worked with, take the safety and the health of their employees very seriously, and feel a very strong moral obligation to keeping their employees and other persons safe and healthy in the workplace. On top of that moral consideration, clearly as employers, we have other concerns regarding maybe our legal and statutory position in this matter. And one of the frequent questions we're asked about is, what do I need to do to stay compliant in this area? One of the challenges we face, of course, as I mentioned earlier, is we have no case law, we have no formal approved codes of practice, we have some guides, but they are just that. And to an extent, as a country, as a society, we are learning about this new novel hazard as we deal with it. So I can understand, fully empathise with employers who have those concerns. As Victoria mentioned earlier, the enforcing body for this hazard within the workplace will be the Health and Safety Executive, as other workplace legislation. And they have also been emphasising the need to carry out a COVID-19 risk assessment. As Victoria also mentioned, the HSE have been provided with additional funding, £14 million for helping to support and encourage and, if necessary, enforce in this area. And we shouldn't forget, of course, that the Health and Safety Executive also have a mechanism of fee for intervention, where if they identify what they consider a material breach of respective legislation, then they can levy charges in relation to their time spent on that breach. The current rate for FMI is £157 per hour. Many of you will have seen the government briefing on the 12th of May, in which Sarah Albon, the current Chief Executive at the HSE, contributed, and you will have picked up, no doubt, on some of the key points that Sarah made during that. It was clear that the HSE's expectation is that employers, amongst their wider group of employees, take particular consideration of vulnerable persons and people with particular personal risks. So I would encourage you during your risk assessments to think about any vulnerable groups or any vulnerable individuals, and record your considerations and your additional precautions for those within your risk assessment record. I thought it was also interesting that Sarah also emphasised that HSE will try to support and guide and advise employers where they can, but if employers seem reluctant or disinclined to take measures and to keep their staff safe and healthy, then they will take enforcement action if necessary. So I think we've had reasonable warning of the HSE's position and their intentions in this respect. Again, Victoria showed this poster earlier. The government has stated that we should share the results of our risk assessments with our employees and have provided one suggested method of doing it. This is not a statutory requirement as yet, but it is a strong recommendation. So you may choose to use the poster provided by the government. You may choose to use a method that gets the same information across in a different way, but by other methods that you deem appropriate. The government has also advised that if possible, employers should consider publishing the results of their risk assessment on their website, and they expect that all businesses with over 50 employees, 50 workers would do so. Again, we haven't been provided with prescriptive methods of doing that, but clearly the requirement here is that we not only consult our employees when we're putting together our risk assessments, but we also share the results from those, the significant findings, not only with our employees, but particularly for larger companies, with the wider community and, of course, our stakeholders. So before we get into the methodology of risk assessment around COVID-19, just a little brief look at the HSE's principles around this. Will be very familiar to those who carry out risk assessments. Very similar process, and indeed, I would argue that we shouldn't try and reinvent the wheel when we're assessing COVID-19 risks. And equally, we shouldn't try to overcomplicate the process. I think if we go back to the 5 key points I was talking about earlier, if we keep those front and centre of our thoughts, then I think that will guide us through the risk assessment process. And I'm also conscious that there'll be many people assessing the COVID-19 risks who maybe have never carried out risk assessments before, or maybe fairly new to the process. And to offer some level of comfort, I would suggest that risk assessment consists of 3 basic questions. And again, if one becomes bogged down or becomes stuck in the process, I would suggest boiling it down to 3 simple questions. What could cause harm to who and how? What are we currently doing? And what else needs to be done? And in its most basic form, that is the risk assessment process. Appreciate that we need to add more detail as we go through, but for people who are new to risk assessment and possibly slightly intimidated or slightly nervous about the process, I would suggest that's a pretty good place to go back to reminding ourselves of what we're trying to achieve. I'd also like to recommend another principle that I think should be key during our risk assessment, and this is again a long-established principle in safety management, the hierarchical approach, and the acronym of ERIC-P. And the principle here is that we start at the top of the hierarchy, trying to work at the higher levels as best we can before we move on to the next level. So clearly this is very applicable to the COVID-19 risk assessment. So where possible, we should eliminate the risk. Can we have people working at home? Can we eliminate contact in the workplace? In which case the risk becomes much more manageable. If we can't eliminate it, then possibly we can reduce the risk by reducing the frequency, the number of people who do work together, and the time that they do spend together. If again we need to have people working together, can we isolate groups? So if we have people working closely within 2 meters, can we keep those groups quite distinct rather than overlapping? If people do have to travel together in vehicles, as much as we would prefer they don't, if that's unavoidable, then again, avoiding overlap between those teams is really important. You will inevitably need to exert a level of control over this. This is not going to happen on its own. And it's very important, and the HSE will expect us to consult and engage with our employees while we are carrying out our risk assessments. And I think anyone who's carried out risk assessments before will be able to verify that actually involving the workforce and the people at the front edge of the risk is very useful in understanding and maybe identifying ways that wouldn't necessarily occur to us. And again, very, very pertinent to the COVID-19 situation, PPE, personal protective equipment, should always be our last resort. And the recent guidance around face coverings has illustrated that, in as much as the guidance and the scientific understanding of the benefits of PPE in normal workplaces is very limited. So we really wouldn't be encouraging employers to go straight to PPE without considering the other hierarchical approach first. And in fact, if we visited a workplace and saw multiple members of staff wearing face masks or face coverings within the workplace, I think one of our first concerns would be that we haven't necessarily fully explored the higher options before we've got to that point. So I think we have another poll, Greg.
Yes, we do. So this one is, how often do you anticipate your employees will need to work within 2 meters of another person? So we've got never, very infrequently, occasionally, often, constantly, or very frequently. So most of you have voted. I'm just going to get a few more seconds. Okay, I'm going to close the poll now. So it's quite a mixed result there. So we've got never at 5%, very infrequently at 28%, occasionally 34%, often at 18%, and constantly or very frequently within 15%. So I'm just going to hide that, and then I'll pass back to you, Dean.
Thank you, Greg. Again, very interesting results. Encouraged that only 15% attendees think that only 50% of their employees will need to work constantly or frequently in close contact. And obviously the large majority of votes falling in the middle ground, which given the early nature or the early stage we are in managing this new risk is entirely understandable. So before we look at the risk assessment tool that we've developed, I just wanted to look at one or two other technical issues around that, just to a few pitfalls that we've identified as we've been working with clients as they develop their COVID-19 risk assessments. And a clear principle for us as safety professionals is we never control one risk by creating another, or indeed increasing an existing risk. And one thing I would encourage people to do is, when they are looking at that COVID-19 risk, try to think of them holistically in the context of other risks that are taking place in your workplace, or might already exist in your workplace. So as some examples, you might want to just review your existing risk assessments in light of your COVID risk assessment, and identify if any areas, any existing risks are being increased as a result. If you have machinery hazards in your workplace, you might want to think very carefully about any additional PPE that you introduce, or any additional distancing measures that might make people operating machinery more at risk. Obviously, restricting people working within 2 meters of each other can create manual handling risks, where maybe there were team lifting activities that now will be challenging without people being 2 meters 2 meters apart. So again, they would need to be very carefully considered, and your manual handling risk assessments might need to be coordinated as a result. Are we likely to create any lone working risks as a result of maybe early opening up or late closing, reduced numbers of staff because we have people working from home? Do our social distancing measures create lone working situations that we might not have previously had? How are we going to manage our maintenance and statutory testing and inspection? Because clearly we would probably consider deferring or rescheduling non-essential maintenance, maybe having it carried out at weekends or outside working hours when the majority of the staff are not present. But how will we manage our statutory testing? And the HSE's expectation is that as far as we reasonably can, we should carry out, continue our statutory testing, and they have indeed provided guidance for that to continue. We need to ensure that our existing fire and emergency procedures are not compromised. So we may well be making layout changes and changing access and egress routes. Are they likely to create any impact upon our fire and emergency procedures? If we have staff working from home who would normally be in the workplace, does that impact our fire marshal quotas? And how will we carry out fire drills? And how will we manage fire assembly points and roll calls with social distancing? So all of these secondary questions that will start to crop up as you carry out your COVID-19 risk assessment. And of course, first aid arrangements. First aiders inevitably are going to be apprehensive about providing close support in the workplace. Again, guidance is available related to CPR under the COVID-19 restrictions. St John Ambulance, amongst other organisations, have published some clear guidance to support us with that. Will we have sufficient first aiders in place, given that we probably have less staff in the workplace? How are those absences being impacting our first aid needs? So a lot of things to consider there. I wouldn't suggest that any of those are insurmountable, but what I am suggesting is that we should at least reflect on those issues as we're carrying out our COVID-19 risk assessment. So, as I mentioned earlier, we developed a coronavirus risk assessment tool some time ago, and been working with a number of our clients on this. The reality is that it is a broad tool. We accept that each different employers have different existing methods of risk assessment, but we wanted to put together a tool that helped clients quickly and efficiently come to some conclusions regarding how they would manage this risk within their workplace. It's been developed in consultation with a number of our clients who've given us feedback, and has been road tested in a number of different sectors and a number of different environments. It provides a framework to record the significant findings of our risk assessment. The feedback we've had is that it's user-friendly and easy to keep updated. It's not intended to be a definitive exercise or definitive tool. Clearly, there will be areas within the overall framework that we will not have covered, or there'll be areas in there that are not applicable to your business. But the point I really wanted to make about the whole risk assessment process as a whole is it shouldn't stifle good business practice. We don't have a monopoly on good ideas, and it shouldn't prevent us from taking what we would consider good common sense precautions. We looked at 10 different areas and activities within a typical workplace. As I mentioned earlier, some of these might not be applicable to your business, and there might be other areas here that are not covered here, but the principle remains the same. And we believe that the tool is adaptable enough that it can be added to and altered to suit each business. And we would encourage you to do that and take ownership of it, and make sure it fits your business and the way you want to work. And again, we should keep front and centre the 5 key points that the HSE and the government have advised us regarding our risk assessment process. So a little bit about the format and how we arrived at this method. On face value, it seems quite a simple process. As I mentioned, we broke the workplace down into 10 areas, 10 activities, 10 functions. We originally trialed a more traditional table risk assessment format, but we quickly found that that was proven to be quite challenging in the context of this particular hazard. How people could be harmed is fairly consistent. So where we had sections for that in our risk assessment, original risk assessment table, we were finding lots of repetition and lots of unnecessary time felt completing that section, which of course was very unproductive in terms of actually coming up with practical controls. We also found likelihood and severity calculations very challenging as well. Many of you who are experienced in risk assessments might use likelihood and severity calculations to arrive at a risk rating. But given the very fluid nature and indeed sometimes conflicting information that we've been receiving over the last few months, it is very difficult to quantify the risk numerically, and we found that even experienced risk assessors were finding it very challenging to settle upon risk calculations around this. And inevitably, as we tend to do when we're unsure, they were defaulting to worst case scenario and basically risk assessing themselves out of a business. So we moved away from that towards a more subjective approach in terms of understanding how we manage that. We found that using traditional table formats, the risk assessment became very long, very technical, and very challenging to communicate to employees. And one of the regular feedback that we got from a more traditional format was that users were finding it very difficult to distill out the key points from the format to form their briefings and their instructions to their staff. And we've just found that the assessors were being bogged down by detail and not necessarily getting to a point where they felt their risk assessment was suitable. So putting all that together, this is the format that we've been using with a number of our clients. We've had very positive feedback about how it's been working. Clients have sometimes wanted to add a little bit more detail themselves, but in terms of prompting actions and encouraging us to record the outcomes of our process and show that we have applied a methodical approach to this, then this seems to be working for the clients we've trialed it with. As I mentioned, there are 10 sections. I'm not going to run through them all in the interest of time today. These suggested precautions or possible precautions that we've listed are partly based on the guidance provided by the government, but also based on good practice we've seen on our travels and in our conversations with clients. As I mentioned earlier, we don't pretend that we have the monopoly on good ideas here. We've seen some very innovative practice and some very good precautions out on sites and in workplaces. So we've tried to share those as best we can within these documents. I think it's really important, as mentioned earlier, to keep a focus on any vulnerable persons within our work groups who are at the workplace, and if necessary, list any controls specific to those within the relevant sections. And as I mentioned earlier, keep a focus on our ERIC P hierarchy. Eliminate, reduce, isolate, control, and only then consider PPE. Not all sections will be applicable to all organisations, so you may or may not have production areas. You may have other areas within your business that are not amongst those we've listed. But as a simple Word document, it's fairly simple for you to edit as you wish. Rest and welfare areas are proving particularly challenging for a number of reasons. What we have found is that whilst employees, initially at least, are very focused upon the risks at their place of work, at their workstation, when they retire to the rest areas, the welfare areas, they may become less focused upon the risks because they're generally at rest. And equally, behaviourally, we're familiar with our welfare areas being a safe place, a safe haven for us. But of course, with this particular hazard, then the risk is as great, if not greater, in welfare areas because of the very communal nature of them normally and the social interaction that normally takes place within a welfare area. So we have found that the welfare areas have been a particular challenge for employers. So we've listed a number of examples here, partly from the government guidance, but also from good practice we've seen, particularly on construction sites and in the construction sector, who, as I mentioned earlier, have probably a week or two ahead of many other sectors, at least in terms of road testing and trialling their measures out on site. Again, meetings have proved challenging. I appreciate we've all got used to remote and virtual meetings now, but as we open up workplaces and have more people into the workplace, there will inevitably be occasions where people want to interact in groups. And I think one of the challenges here, again, behavioural, is breaking long-standing habits and etiquette around meetings. I found myself a few days ago having to stop myself stretching out my hand to shake hands because it was just part of the nature and part of the courtesy we normally extend to each other. So again, I would encourage people to think particularly carefully about any meetings that might take place within your workplace and helping people to change their habits in that respect. And finally, it's really important that we think about incident management and emergency planning. If we fail to plan, no doubt our plan will fail. So I think it's really important to think about planning for employees reporting symptoms whilst they're at work, how we might deal with those, what rooms we might use to deal with that issue in the first instance, how that person might be transferred home afterwards, and how we might work closely and support people who maybe come into contact with that person while they've been at work. And as I mentioned earlier, please do think carefully about your existing emergency plans and how they might be impacted by your COVID-19 risk assessment and arrangements. You might want to consider desktop exercises to simulate an incident and talk through the management systems and the management reactions to that, or you might want to even consider drills or practices with your first aiders to iron out any small wrinkles that might be particular to your workplace. And at the end of the risk assessment tool, there's a very simple risk assessment action plan. Now, again, you may have your own internal processes for planning and coordinating and tracking actions. But again, we provide just a simple process here that you may or may not wish to use. So, Greg, I believe we have one final poll.
We do, and this one is quite simply, how will you ensure that your COVID-19 risk assessments remain valid and up to date? So will you be diarising, so you do formal reviews, regular management or team reviews, just when you've just updated when new guidance is issued, or we're all busy but when we have time? Okay, so quite a few people already responded. I'm just going to give it a few more seconds. Okay, I'm going to close the poll now. So again, a mixture of results. So some of you will have diarised formal reviews at 15%. Some of you will be doing it at regular management reviews at 58%. And then 27% of you will be waiting for when guidance is issued, and nobody has said that they'll just when you have time. So it's good to hear. I'll close that poll now and pass back to you, Dean.
Thank you, Greg. Very reassured that everyone who polled will have some sort of formal process or scheduled process for reviewing their risk assessments. I think the reality is that this is a new, novel experience for all of us. Even those of us who are experienced and comfortable with managing risk in the workplace are having to go back to basics and think of equally novel approaches to manage. Most plans face some level of attrition with first contact, so it's really important that we keep those risk assessments as a live document, keep reviewing them, and make sure they're up to date. So that risk assessment tool is available free of charge from our website. I'll give you details in a second around that. And I would suggest that, like any other good management process, we should be following the plan, do, check, act model. Some of you would be familiar with this model from your normal business management processes. And one service that we've been offering to clients and is proving to be quite popular, even in the early days, are our COVID-19 reassurance audits. For the reasons that we mentioned earlier, employers may be feeling nervous and apprehensive, may want to provide some level of reassurance to their own employees and to other stakeholders. So we have been offering a service to clients to carry out remote COVID-19 reassurance audits for them. Very simple desktop process, at least initially. Facilitated via a remote meeting and questionnaire, and followed up by a report with a review of where you are now and recommendations for further actions. So, if that's a service you think that might provide you with some reassurance, we'd be delighted to talk to you about that. And as I mentioned earlier, all of the risk assessment tool is available from our website, and please do feel free to email me directly if you have any questions, or we can be of any assistance. So I think we may have one or two questions.
Yep, so I think there's been quite a few questions coming through as you've been talking, Dean, but Sue, I think you're going to field those questions and read them out, is that correct? Are you there, Sue? Okay, I think we've lost Sue, so I'm just going to read a couple out for you, Dean. So, one question was, obviously, are you going to share your template? So you've provided that information on the screen, and we'll follow that up on the follow-up from this webinar. Everyone will get a link to your website as well. So that will answer most of the questions that came through. And one question was, do you think that the government guidance is going to change in the future as well, and how will we be able to respond to that?
An excellent question. I do think that the guidance will evolve. I think the basic tenet of how we stay safe will stay the same, but I think if the guides aren't replaced, there will be supplementary guidance issued. I think as scientific and technical knowledge of how the virus promulgates and how it can be best controlled, I think there will be new or supplementary guidance, but we can only work with what we've got in front of us now. I have to say, having worked with the guides since they were published, I think they are very good tools. I commend them to anybody who is dealing with this challenging problem, this challenging issue at the moment. But yes, I do expect some supplementary guidance over time.
Okay, that's great.
I think I'm back, Greg. Are you there? Can you hear me?
I can hear you now, yeah. This is the second time we've done that to me.
I know. Sorry, I've got it working. I've got a couple
okay.
of questions ready. Did you want me to ask them? Or
if you have them ready, yeah.
Yeah. We've got a number of questions, Dean, about visiting other client premises. Do we need to ask to see their risk assessments before we send clients to them? They're working on site at client premises.
I wouldn't necessarily ask to see the risk assessment because they can often be long, technical and quite broad documents. But what I would be doing is asking for reassurance from my host or my client that they have, and asking them what measures they have taken. I often think risk assessments are used out of context. I can draw a parallel example. Many organisations ask contractors to read through their risk assessments to sign off that they read and acknowledge them, where often a great deal of that risk assessment is not relevant at all to that contractor. So I strongly encourage sharing the necessary information or asking for the necessary information before we attend, seeking reassurance that they have carried out a risk assessment. But I suppose I would ask the question, if you've got it, what are you going to do with it? Are you going to read it through line by line and vet it, or are you really just looking, are you more importantly looking for some reassurance that before you send your employee to that workplace over which you have little, if any, control, that the host has taken reasonable precautions? So I would personally be asking for some reassurance and the precautions that are in place to protect my employee or my representative, rather than the risk assessment in its entirety.
Okay, thank you. And there have also been several questions about public transport and how far that is a responsibility of the of the client to consider. So employers who can only travel in by public transport, when they risk assess, if they need them on the premises, and that's the only way they can travel.
Yeah, again, an excellent question. And I think it all comes down to reasonableness. I think my view would be that if you could demonstrate that you've explored all possible alternatives using ERIC P, as we mentioned before, eliminate, reduce, isolate, control, and PPE as it relates to public transport. I think if you can demonstrate that you've applied that principle, that you've considered all reasonable options or reasonable alternatives, and there is no practical alternative other than start to use public transport, and you've pointed them in the direction or provided them with the government guidance, and I think as a reasonable and responsible employer, that would be considered reasonable. But I think it's important to be able to apply that principle and demonstrate that you've explored all possible alternatives. If I give you an example, one of my colleagues today is carrying out some site inspections in London. He would normally go by public transport, but by rearranging our plans and rearranging our schedules and his method of working, he's travelled in his own vehicle, and we've been able to accommodate that.
I guess people also might have to look at whether they can rent car park spaces for people to allow that to facilitate that as well.
Exactly. I think it was less of a challenge a week or two ago when motorways and urban conurbations were relatively lightly populated, but that seems, from what I'm hearing, that seems to be changing. So yeah, you're quite right. So one would need to think about the practicalities of that. But to go back to the initial question, yeah, I would reiterate, if you can demonstrate you've applied good principles and done all that's reasonable, I think it's very difficult to do any more than that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you, Dean. Obviously, there was quite a few questions that came through, but I'm conscious of time, so we will follow some of those up after the webinar's finished. So while you were asking those questions, I took the control back from Dean. So I just want to say thank you, Dean, for that. It was really informative. And thank you, Victoria, on your first webinar with us. So well done to you both. Just by way of a pointer, we will follow up with an email to everybody. If you have questions, you can reply to that email and we will field them out. Alternatively, you have our telephone number there and our inquiries email address, and we'll pick those up from there. And Dean has provided his email address already, but if any come to us, then we'll field those to Dean as well. Dean mentioned the kind of offering that his organisation can provide in terms of helping you do your risk assessments. We also have a resource planning offer for our clients and anybody else who would like to use it. And that's really to kind of talk through how you're planning to bring your staff back from being furloughed or just back to work from working at home, and talk through what you're basically trying to achieve and how we can point you in the right direction using either the furlough scheme or some other options around bringing people back to work. It might be useful to do that in tandem with doing your risk assessments through Dean as well. After the webinar, there will be an email that you get which will have a link to some feedback as well, so please let us know any areas that we can improve. Hopefully you found today really useful. This webinar is recorded, and we'll come on to that section in a second, but we also have some other upcoming webinars as well. Hopefully many of you have been on some of our previous webinars, but we have been doing one, if not two a week during this period of time. And you can see on the screen there are many that we've got over the next couple of weeks, but again there'll be a link to those if you want to sign up on the email afterwards. If you're not already on our newsletter, then please sign up. That will mean you'll get informed of all of our upcoming webinars with an easy link to click. Equally, any change in legislation or guidance, we update everybody via our newsletters as well, so you stay up to date as quick as possible. And quite often there'll be templates that will help you and support you with that change in guidance as well. As I mentioned, the webinars are recorded, so you will be able to have access to this webinar as well as our previous webinars from our website, and we'll put a link to that on the email that follows up as well. So again, just a big thank you to Victoria and Dean and all our attendees. Appreciate we went over time slightly, but hopefully you found it really useful. It was useful to get your feedback on this webinar when you get the email as well. And any other questions, then please do come back to us and we will field those out to the relevant people. So thank you once again, and we're just about to close the webinar.